In 2024, NASA aimed radar at the Greenland ice sheet and found something that should not still be there. Compressed tunnel outlines, a reactor chamber, storage tanks, waste fields. Under 35 meters of ice sat the crushed skeleton of a secret American military city, a chapel, a movie theater, a barber shop, a library, and a nuclear reactor. It was built by the United States Army in 1959, hidden from Denmark, which owned the land, and quietly abandoned in 1967 with 200,000 liters of diesel and an unknown quantity of radioactive waste left inside. The ice was supposed to bury it forever. Climate change found it anyway. That is not where this story begins. It begins in Washington in the late 1950s, inside a Cold War problem that had no clean solution. American nuclear missiles sat in fixed, identifiable underground silos. The Soviets knew exactly where they were. A coordinated first strike could, in theory, destroy the entire American nuclear arsenal before a single warhead launched in response. The United States had spent its way into a trap. General James M. Gavin had been studying this problem from inside the Army's Chief of Research and Development Office. He was a former World War II airborne commander, not a man easily stopped by logistical difficulty. His argument was blunt. If you cannot protect a fixed target, make the target move. Scatter the missiles across terrain so vast and so hostile that no satellite could track them all, and no first strike could kill them all at once. He needed a geography that could absorb 4,000 kilometers of tunnel and give nothing away from the surface. The Greenland ice sheet is roughly the size of Mexico, a featureless white plateau, 7,000 feet above sea level in the interior, swept by winds that could reach 100 miles an hour, and temperatures that destroyed exposed skin in minutes. Uninhabited, remote, and critically, already inside the American security umbrella, the 1951 defense agreement between Washington and Copenhagen had granted the United States military access to Greenland, including the existing Thule Air Base on the northwest coast. The plan was called Project Iceworm. 600 Minuteman ballistic missiles, each nuclear-armed, hidden in mobile launch vehicles, inside 4,000 kilometers of tunnels bored through the Greenland ice sheet. No Soviet satellite could know where any given missile was positioned on any given day. No first strike could destroy them all. On paper, it was the most survivable second strike nuclear platform the Army had ever imagined. To make it real, they needed to prove the ice could be worked. They needed a test site. They needed a story to tell the Danes. Camp Century became both. In the summer of 1959, Army engineers arrived roughly 150 kilometers inland from Thule, hauled across the ice on tracked vehicles. The cutting tool was a rotary snow milling machine, a tracked platform with a rotating cutter that sliced through compacted ice. Crews cut a trench, lowered in prefabricated corrugated steel arch sections, bolted them together, and backfilled the top. 21 times. The main corridor, the one they called Main Street, ran approximately 1,100 feet through the ice, lit by electric cable, wide enough for a tracked vehicle. They did not build a forward outpost. They built a city, a chapel, a barber shop, a library, a movie theater, a gym, and a mess hall serving hot food in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. A hospital, all of it carved into a glacier in the high Arctic, on land that belonged to Denmark, a country whose government had been told this was a science station. The Danes were not told about Project Iceworm. They were not told about the nuclear reactor the Army was preparing to install and operate under Danish sovereign territory. Denmark maintained a formal national policy against nuclear weapons on its soil. The gap between that policy and what was happening inside the ice was not an accident. It was a choice. The Greenlandic people had no voice in any of it. In 1959, Greenland was administered from Copenhagen, a colony in everything but name, without political representation in decisions being made about their own land. The ICE, meanwhile, did not care about alliance politics. The Greenland ice sheet moves. not as a metaphor. The entire mass flows slowly toward the coast at roughly 3 to 4 meters per year. That pressure is constant and indifferent. Within months of construction, tunnel walls at Camp Century began to deform. Timber support beams splintered. The Army put maintenance crews to work shoring up sections that the ice was already trying to reclaim. The geography that made Project Iceworm seem brilliant was already, from the first winter underground, proving it could not work. In 1960, the Army's portable nuclear reactor, designation PM-2A, went critical under the Greenland ice. 1.5 megawatts of electrical power generated inside a glacier on Danish sovereign territory without Danish consent. The lights on Main Street burned brighter. The mess hall stayed warm. The hospital had power. The movie theater ran its weekly reel. Camp Century was, by any measure, fully alive. The PM-2A had been transported by ship to Thule Air Base and then hauled across the ice on sleds. It was the first nuclear reactor the United States Army had ever deployed in a remote operations role. The soldiers assigned to operate it were trained nuclear technicians working in conditions no reactor had previously encountered, inside a structure made of moving ice, in an environment that could kill an unprotected man in minutes if anything went wrong on the surface. They maintained it. They kept it running. For 4 years, the reactor held. Up to 200 men lived at Camp Century at peak operation, a mix of Army soldiers, civilian contractors, and scientists. Their daily routine had a strange normalcy to it. Men walked Main Street in cold weather gear between meals. They got haircuts in the barber shop. They checked out books. On scheduled nights, they filled the movie theater and watched Hollywood films printed on 16-millimeter reels trucked in from Thule. Church services were held in the ice chapel. The mess hall served meals calibrated to the high caloric demands of Arctic work. Mail came in and went out, though letters home described only Arctic research and temperatures in the negative double digits. The classified nature of the base meant that almost nothing men experienced there could be fully explained to the people they had left behind. The Army understood this was not sustainable as a secret of omission. In response, it produced a promotional film, publicly released, that showed Camp Century exactly as it wanted to be seen. Clean tunnels, dedicated scientists, a modern facility conquering the hostile Arctic in the name of knowledge. The film showed the reactor. It showed the drilling. It showed men at work and men at rest. It did not show Project Iceworm. It did not show 600 nuclear missiles. It showed a science station, because a science station was the story, and the story needed to hold. The science, to its credit, was real. Chester Langway, an Army glaciologist assigned to Camp Century, led a drilling program that in 1966 extracted an ice core reaching 1,390 meters into the ice sheet, deep enough to recover ice laid down more than 100,000 years ago. Trapped inside that ancient ice were air bubbles containing atmospheric records that no other archive on Earth could match. Langway's cores became founding documents of climate science. They helped establish what the Earth's atmosphere looked like before industrialization. They helped researchers understand how the ice sheet had behaved through previous warm periods. They were among the most scientifically valuable objects the base ever produced. Langway did not know he was doing landmark science inside the cover story for a program the Army already knew was failing. By approximately 1962 or 1963, the exact internal documentation is not fully public. Army assessments had concluded that ice movement made Project Iceworm physically unworkable. The maintenance demands of keeping even Camp Century's 21 tunnels open were already enormous. 4,000 kilometers of operational missile tunnels through the same moving ice was beyond any realistic budget or engineering capacity. The mission was gone. The conclusion was internal, classified, and inconvenient. The base kept running. Men still walked Main Street. The movie theater still showed its weekly film. The chapel still held services. Scientists still drilled. The promotional film still circulated. The cover story still needed a facility behind it, so the facility stayed open, staffed, and funded for years after the reason it was secretly built had been quietly buried in an assessment report. In 1964, the PM-2A reactor was pulled from its chamber and removed from the ice. Not because the mission was ending, officially it was not, but because the Arctic environment had pushed the reactor's maintenance requirements past what the Army could sustain in that location. Diesel generators replaced it. The reactor was extracted, loaded onto sleds, and hauled back to Thule. What it left behind in the reactor chamber, coolant water carrying radioactive material, stayed. The first piece of nuclear infrastructure had left Camp Century. What it left behind had not. The diesel generators ran. The lights stayed on. Men still arrived from Thule by tracked vehicle, still ascended the ramps, still entered the tunnels. The ice kept moving. The walls kept deforming. Maintenance crews kept working to hold the structure open. And somewhere in the classified record, the Army already knew that none of this had ever been going to work the way Gavin's strategic vision had imagined it. The question was no longer whether Camp Century would close. It was what would be left inside when it did. In 1967, the last men left Camp Century. The diesel generators were shut down. The tunnels went dark. The barber shop, the chapel, the movie theater, the hospital, the library, all of it stayed exactly where it was, sealed inside the ice. There was no formal decommissioning in the sense that anyone would recognize today. There was a departure. The ramps leading down from the surface were filled in. Within a few seasons of Arctic snowfall, the site was visually indistinguishable from any other point on the Greenland ice cap. Flat, white, empty in every direction. The Army left behind approximately 200,000 liters of diesel fuel in storage tanks beneath the ice. It left behind approximately 240,000 liters of liquid waste, sewage, wastewater, the accumulated biological residue of 200 men living underground for years. It left behind an unknown quantity of radioactive coolant water from the PM-2A reactor chamber. It left behind polychlorinated biphenyls. The official position, to the extent there was one, rested on a single assumption. The accumulating snowfall would bury everything permanently. The ice would hold it. The Arctic would close over it like a wound. That assumption was built on a static model of a system that does not stand still. Denmark was not informed of what had been left inside the ice on its sovereign territory. The Greenlandic people, who had no seat at the table in 1951, no voice in 1959, and no notification in 1967, were left as the nearest human population to an abandoned nuclear-adjacent waste site they had never been told existed. Greenland gained home rule from Denmark in 1979 and expanded self-governance in 2009. Neither transition came with a briefing on Camp Century's buried contents. For decades, the site was effectively invisible, not secret in an active sense, more like forgotten or filed away under the assumption that the Arctic had handled it. The Cold War ended. The Soviet threat that had animated Project Iceworm dissolved. The 4,000 kilometers of missile tunnels that were never built stopped mattering to anyone with a security clearance. Camp Century receded into the category of things that had happened and been resolved. Then in 2016, a researcher at York University named William Colgan led a team that published a study in Geophysical Research Letters. His team calculated the waste inventory at Camp Century, the diesel, the sewage, the radioactive coolant, the PCBS, and then ran it against climate projections for the Greenland ice sheet. What they found was not reassuring. Under mid-range warming scenarios, the ice above Camp Century would reach net ablation, meaning snowfall could no longer keep pace with melt as early as 2090. The waste field, currently under approximately 35 meters of compacted ice and snow, would begin moving toward the surface. Colgan's team noted something that had apparently not been formally addressed in the 49 years since abandonment. The waste at Camp Century had no legal owner. The United States had created it on Danish territory without Danish consent and had not claimed responsibility for its removal. Denmark had not consented to its storage and had not committed to cleaning it up. The Greenlandic government had inherited the liability without inheriting any of the decision-making that produced it. The 2016 study triggered diplomatic correspondence. Denmark raised the issue formally with the United States. Greenland's government requested clarity on legal responsibility. As of the time this story is told, no cleanup plan has been agreed upon. No cost estimate has been formally committed to. No timeline has been established. The waste does not require a political resolution before it begins to move. It is already moving, compressed inside ice that is itself in motion, following the same 3 to 4 meters per year that crushed Camp Century's timber supports 60 years ago. Chester Langway's ice cores, the ones drilled inside the cover story for a mission the Army knew had failed, are preserved today at the National Ice Core Laboratory in Denver. Researchers still study them. The climate data locked inside that ancient ice continues to inform models of how fast the Greenland ice sheet is changing. The irony is not poetic, it is structural. In 2024, NASA radar looked through the ice and found the base, the compressed tunnel outlines, the deformed geometry of Main Street, the reactor chamber, the waste fields. Everything the Army assumed was permanently buried, still there, still identifiable, now visible to instruments that did not exist when the decision to walk away was made. The chapel is still down there, so is the theater, and the barber shop, and the diesel, and the radioactive coolant. The ice the Army trusted to keep the secret is the same ice carrying it, slowly, toward the light.